I read of it first in the strange book of von Juntz, the German eccentric who lived so curiously and died in such grisly and mysterious fashion. It was my fortune to have access to his Nameless Cults in the original edition, the so-called Black Book, published in Dusseldorf in 1839, shortly before a hounding doom overtook the author. Collectors of rare literature are familiar with Nameless Cults, mainly through the cheap and faulty translation which was pirated in London by Bridewell in 1845, and the carefully expurgated edition put out by the Golden Goblin Press of New York in 1909. But the volume I stumbled upon was one of the unexpurgated German copies, with heavy leather covers and rusty iron hasps. I doubt if there are more than half a dozen such volumes in the entire world today, for the quantity issued was not great. And when the manner of the author's demise was bruited about, many possessors of the book burned their volumes in panic. Von Juntz spent his entire life, 1795 through 1840, delving into forbidden subjects. He traveled in all parts of the world, gained entrance into innumerable secret societies, and read countless little-known and esoteric books and manuscripts in the original. And in the chapters of the Black Book, which range from startling clarity of exposition to murky ambiguity, there are statements and hints to freeze the blood of a thinking man. Reading what von Juntz dared put in print arouses uneasy speculations as to what it was that he dared not tell. What dark matters, for instance, were contained in those closely written pages that formed the unpublished manuscript on which he worked unceasingly for months before his death, and which lay torn and scattered all over the floor of the locked and bolted chamber in which von Juntz was found dead, with the marks of taloned fingers on his throat. It will never be known, for the author's closest friend, the Frenchman Alexis Ladau, after having spent a whole night piecing the fragments together and reading what was written, burnt them to ashes and cut his own throat with a razor. That, my friends, is from the terrifying story The Black Stone by Robert E. Howard. That's right, Robert E. Howard. We're talking about a Robert E. Howard story today. The Black Stone, a story that is firmly in the Cthulhu mythos created by H.P. Lovecraft. This story was published in 1931 in Weird Tales magazine. Robert E. Howard, of course, the famous creator of Conan and King Kull and Bran MacMorn and Solomon Kane and a whole bunch of other cool characters. His chief fictional outlet was Weird Tales, just like H.P. Lovecraft. He was one of the big three, along with H.P. Lovecraft and Clark Ashton Smith in Weird Tales magazine. Weird Tales magazine, the greatest horror and fantasy pulp of all from back in the day. So Robert E. Howard was very influenced by his friend H.P. Lovecraft. They were pen pals. They never met each other in real life, unfortunately, but they sent a bunch of letters to each other. They were big fans of each other's work, and they influenced each other quite a bit. And this story, The Black Stone, the story of a mysterious stone in the mountains of Hungary. What's the story with this mysterious stone? What is this stone's strange power? So, Robert E. Howard wrote this story, and he was very influenced when he wrote this by the work of H.P. Lovecraft. He really appreciated the work of H.P. Lovecraft, loved it, really liked his horror stuff. And so when he wrote horror stories, a lot of his horror stories were heavily influenced by Lovecraft. But being Robert E. Howard, he couldn't make his story sound like Lovecraft. When you read the beginning of this story, it kind of sounds like Lovecraft, but it shifts straight into Robert E. Howard territory right away. So in this story, we have an unnamed narrator who stumbles upon tales of the Black Stone, which is this mysterious black monolith that stands in the mountains of Hungary. And he first stumbles upon it in this mysterious text, Nameless Cults, also known as Unusprechlichen Kulten by Frederick Van Junts. He stumbles upon it there, and then he also recognizes this black stone as a stone that was mentioned by a poet, the mad poet Justin Geoffrey. We hear more about Justin Geoffrey later in different stories, not just by Robert E. Howard. H.P. Lovecraft took a lot of the stuff from the Black Stone and talked about it in his later stories. Because they would do that. They would add to the mythos, the different writers, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert E. Howard, and a few others. And they would sprinkle these allusions throughout their stories to give it more of a sense of reality. So they would refer to things in each other's stories, which is why you get a lot of references to Robert E. Howard's work in H.P. Lovecraft's work, and vice versa, of course. So our narrator recognizes this stone is one that was written about by a poet, this mad poet, Justin Geoffrey, who of course came to a bad end. Anybody who has anything to do with this stuff tends to come to a bad end. But he's really fascinated by the idea of this mysterious stone and the strange supernatural powers that it might possess. So when he finds out kind of where the stone might be, he finds out that it is near the town of Stragiocavar. Stragiocavar. You know me, I can barely pronounce English, let alone any other language. But he finds out this stone might be there, and he's got a vacation coming up. You know what? I think I'm going to vacation in Hungary and check out this mysterious supernatural stone. What's the worst that can happen? Well, he decides to do this. He goes out of his way to travel to this place. And while he's at this place, he's talking to his innkeeper, and there's this little exchange here that I will read to you now. So, I found the village of Stragiocavar, a dreamy, drowsy little village that apparently belied its sinister cognomen, a forgotten back eddy that progress had passed by. The quaint houses and the quieter dress and manners of the people were those of an earlier century. They were friendly, mildly curious, but not inquisitive, though visitors from the outside world were extremely rare. 10 years ago, another American came here and stayed a few days in the village, said the owner of the tavern where I had put up. A young fellow, and queer acting, mumbled to himself. A poet, I think. I knew he must mean Justin Geoffrey. Yes, he was a poet, I answered, and he wrote a poem about a bit of scenery near this very village. Indeed, mine host's interest was aroused. Then, since all great poets are strange in their speech and actions, he must have achieved great fame, for his actions and conversations were the strangest of any man I ever knew. As is usual with artists, I answered, most of his recognition has come since his death. He is dead then? He died screaming in a madhouse 5 years ago. Too bad, sighed mine host sympathetically. Poor lad, he looked too long at the Black Stone. My heart gave a leap, but I masked my keen interest and said casually, I have heard something of this Black Stone. Somewhere near this village, is it not? Nearer than Christian folk wish, he responded. Look! He drew me to a latticed window and pointed up at the fir-clad slopes of the brooding blue mountains. There, Beyond where you see the bare face of that jutting cliff stands that accursed stone. Would that it were ground to powder and the powder flung into Junab to be carried to the deepest ocean. Once men tried to destroy the thing, but each man who laid hammer or maul against it came to an evil end. So now the people shun it. What is there so evil about it? I asked curiously. It is a demon-haunted thing, he answered uneasily and with suggestion of a shudder. In my childhood I knew a young man who came up from below and laughed at our traditions. In his foolhardiness, he went to the stone one midsummer night, and at dawn stumbled into the village again, stricken dumb and mad. Something had shattered his brain and sealed his lips, for until the day of his death, which came soon after, he spoke only to utter terrible blasphemies or to slaver gibberish. My own nephew, when very small, was lost in the mountains and slept in the woods near this stone, and now in his manhood he is tortured by foul dreams, so that at times he makes the night hideous with his screams, and wakes with cold sweat upon him. So, this black stone, it's bad news. So our narrator, being the sort of guy he is, has to investigate further. He wanders up into the hills. He finds the black stone. He feels a bit weary. He takes a nap, and then, well, really grisly things ensue in this story. One thing I have to give to Robert E. Howard, this story, The Black Stone, is more grisly and hardcore in its horror than anything Lovecraft ever wrote. Lovecraft wrote some grisly, horrible stuff, but this story, man, it takes a turn right around this point. Yeah, it's pretty heavy horror stuff that happens within a couple pages in this story. It's an excellent story. It is one of Robert E. Howard's greatest horror stories. Robert E. Howard's horror stories could be kind of hit and miss because he was chiefly an adventure story writer. He wrote all kinds of stories, Robert E. Howard, and he was fantastic in just about everything that he did. He wrote great historical stories. His Conan stories are legendary. All his fantasy stories are great. Some of his horror stories tend to be, like I said, a little hit and miss, but this is one of the good ones, The Black Stone. This has been anthologized to death. You'll find this story, The Black Stone, in a lot of anthologies. It's probably the mark of a quality anthology if The Black Stone is in it. It is one of his greatest horror stories. I don't know if it is his greatest horror story. There are a couple others that come close, and we will be talking about them. Because Mythos Monday, as we now know it, only has a couple episodes to go. I'm going to be shifting gears in the very near future from H.P. Lovecraft, who I've been talking about for months now, and I'm going to be talking about this author that I think needs more attention. That is, of course, Robert E. Howard. Everybody knows Robert E. Howard from Conan, and eventually I'll be talking about Conan. But he wrote so much, this guy, Robert E. Howard, and all of it, well, most of it is so great that I really feel like I need to spend some time talking about Robert E. Howard. So within a couple weeks, after I do my next couple Lovecraft Mythos Mondays, I'm going to be moving on to Robert E. Howard, which I think is overdue. It's overdue that I talk more about this guy, Robert E. Howard. So that was your Mythos Monday for today. Robert E. Howard's fantastic story, The Black Stone. If you can dig up The Black Stone somewhere, definitely read it. You can find it in this fantastic volume, The Horror Stories of Robert E. Howard, still available in print or ebook. It's great. Check it out. I will catch you tomorrow when I talk about what is tomorrow? Tomorrow is Tuesday. So Tuesday, yes, tomorrow I'm going to be talking about the fantasy books I'll be reading in 2022 and beyond. So I'll catch you then. You guys have a great day.